Thank you everyone for coming. This is a really great turnout and perhaps better than expected. I wanted to say also Ramadan Mubarak to friends here who may be tired after a long day of fasting. Just as a note, as a gift to you all, a community member is bringing in dates from Jericho, from Palestinian farmers in Jericho. She's running a little late, and some spinach pies to share. So as a thank you for being patient while we get ready, we'll feed you something. I want to start by thanking the Lincoln Library for hosting this event, and especially to Sarah Blanco for serving as our library liaison for this program. And I also wanted to thank the Center for Lincoln Studies at UIS for their generous support in supplying copies of Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Message. We were able to provide 20 copies thanks to the Center and Jake Reifeld. And finally, thank you to the Departments of English, History, and of Sociology and Anthropology for co-sponsoring this event and helping to publicize it. This panel came together out of a series of brief comments, interjections across our shared hallways, then emails at work as new interviews about Ta-Nehisi Coates' book came out. The relevance of his interviews to daily life, issues of race and racism in Springfield and the nation, the failure of the press to meet the moments of the past months, or perhaps years, and of the genocide in Palestine. At every turn, something more drew us to this text and pulled us together to bring together this event and this conversation about the message. Coates' book made a splash with his first interview on the CBS morning show, where a self-described colleague and friend attempted to diminish Coates' accomplishments and equated him and his writing as the work of an extremist. Coates' response was a masterclass in intellectual and moral clarity. As much as this event was an attack on Coates' writing about Palestine, it was also a stark demonstration of racism in action. Tony DeCopel attempted to silence Coates unsuccessfully and sidelined his two black co-hosts as he turned the interview into a confrontation. DeCopel's strategy backfired in subsequent appearances as Coates continued to engage in a series of discussions about the attacks on him, which also created space for Coates to reiterate the importance of Palestinian voices in rewriting the narratives of Western media that they had crafted to protect Israel from criticism. And it also underlined the ways in which race and the oppression of Palestinians is tied to race and oppression in the United States, and particularly the oppression of Black Americans. I'm excited to be on this panel with three of my colleagues tonight, each of whom I respect as scholars, educators, and humans. Dr. Niraj Rajashekar received his PhD from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities in sociology. His work focuses on public and cultural discourses on race and diversity, especially in the media. I'm Dr. Christy Barnwell, an associate professor of history with an emphasis on modern Middle East history, politics, and culture, especially in the context of imperial and post-imperial states. I came to UIS with a PhD in history from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Lisa Johnson is an associate professor of sociology with her doctorate from University of Nebraska at Lincoln. She specializes in race and social inequity. In addition to her published work on Black women's mental health in social and professional contexts, Dr. Johnson also focuses on applied community-centered scholarship in Springfield. And Dr. Akash Belsari is an assistant professor in the English department. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in English and African American and Diaspora Studies. His research centers on multi-ethnic literature, comparative race studies, and the racialization of human-animal encounters in literature. Tonight's program will begin with us speaking for approximately 10 minutes each in the order I just presented, drawing out important themes and connections from the message in our areas of study. And we'll then open the rest of the evening for the more participatory discussion of the book using the questions we sent out for those who registered in advance, but we'll have them provided via the PowerPoints for broader discussion if they're needed. So we'll start with Niraj.
Wait, should I get on my feet and go to the podium if we're doing this right?
As you like.
Okay, great, because I don't want to twist my neck. Can everyone hear me if I don't use the microphone? Okay, great. Next slide, please. So, as Christy mentioned, I'm a sociologist. And before we dive into the topic that I want to talk about, the social construction of race, I wanted to briefly define the field of sociology. Just like ogres and onions, sociology is about layers. The study of human individuals in a human society, and every level in between the big picture and the small picture. And I think some social science fields are very good at either one of those two, but I think where sociology really shines is recognizing those medium layers as very impactful in our lives and our existences. Seeing the forest for the trees, or the swamp, if you will. Next slide, please. Thank you. I always like to end and close all my lectures and classes with the sociology and other social science fields. People often, you drive a car that doesn't make you a mechanical engineer. Similarly, living in society doesn't necessarily make you an expert on every social topic, right? And of course, I don't think there's anyone in this room who I have to argue with that, but I forgot I had that slide in here. We can keep going. Next slide. Okay, so race is a social construction. One of the biggest lies we've been told in our lives is that there is a biological entity that we can actually call race. It is an inhuman interpretation of natural human variation. Next slide, please. You can hit the space bar a few times. There's a couple pictures. Thanks. So social constructions are the most important things that don't exist in our lives. There's a couple more pictures, and you can hit the space bar a couple more times. Oh, sorry, back. There we go, thank you. Things like Santa Claus are a good example of what we sociologists call a social construction. I hope I'm not bearing any bad news. Santa Claus isn't real, right? We can all move on, sorry to ruin your day. Yet, the significance of Santa Claus does matter. Every December in this country, people put on outfits and sit at the mall. And the existence of Santa Claus still has social impacts on the world around us. Money is a social construction, right? What makes a dollar bill worthy of exchange is the fact that people agree upon money's value. That gives it significance. So if I have to define the concept of a social construction, things which aren't real in the absolute physical sense but have important impacts on our real lives. And while money is a social construction, it's certainly important, right? It certainly defines our lives. Ultimately, social constructions work like road signs. They help us, for better or for worse, guide our social lives in the society that we live in. Race is a social construction, not a biological entity. What exactly does that mean? Next slide, please. So, everyone familiar with the term Neolithic Revolution, which is around the time that humanity went from a hunter-gatherer species to what we know as an agrarian farming species today. Around the time the Neolithic Revolution happened and the great migrations from which humanity spread from the cradle of civilization. Next slide, please. Well before what we know as race came into being, the social construction that we call race, the physical variation we associate with different parts of the world had come into place. By the end of the Neolithic Revolution, after hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, and there's some anthropologists in the room who can tell you more about that because that's not my area of expertise. But after hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution and migration, we did arrive at the point where people from different climates had different physical appearances, mostly because of vitamin D overabundance or deficiency, leading some areas to develop what we call darker skin and what we call lighter skin. Next slide, please. So, in the interest of time, I won't go through the entire history of every multinational empire that has ever existed. But how many people like myself did K through 12 in American educational systems? And I think, pretty much everyone, I think a lie that we are often taught is that the European colonizers were the first people to interact with somebody outside of their own racial group. This is far from true. So if we can just jump through a few more slides in the interest of time, because I'm being a mic hog, but for lots of human history, that's fine. For lots of human history, people have met someone who doesn't look like themselves. And while discrimination, bigotry, prejudice certainly existed, the idea that one group of people are biologically incapable of reading or lacking the ability to have democratic governance was not a grounded idea the same way that it was grounded in the later eras of European colonization. So next slide, please. And I think this is a GIF. We'll see if it plays. Yeah, okay. Surely you've all taken some history class and you know that while the European empires were not the first multinational empires of the world, they were some of the largest and most impactful upon the development of what we know as our modern society. It was during this time that race was socially constructed. Again, I'm not denying that the empires of Caesar or Genghis Khan wouldn't have had their own prejudices or bigotries, but what we know as racism, putting people in this category and then assuming that one group is inherently subhuman, was not a common practice prior to the European colonizations and the post-Renaissance era. Next slide, please. So there's a couple bullet points if we can pull those up. Thank you. So previous empires prior to European imperialism used what we call indirect rule for the most part, where as long as the conquered territory is sending off their taxes and their tributes, they are, for the most part, allowed to keep their local government and their local culture. The earlier waves of European imperialism did use this approach. However, in the later waves of European imperialism, we had high direct rule. And this was the beginning of enslavement and new forms of cultural domination and the destruction of art, culture, and religion in the conquered territory. A completely new way of life for the conquered territories, as opposed to previous empires, such as that of Genghis Khan. It was here that race was socially constructed. Academia, both the social sciences and the biological sciences of the 1500s onwards, was tasked with a prerogative by European empires. Create this thing called race to justify racism. So race was not something that was created as a scientific category, and I say that in quotes, by accident or as an intellectual curiosity. Race and racism were created for the purpose of legitimating a new form of dominant enslavement and direct rule. And while I think it's very easy to think about academics today as a certain political orientation and mission, academia at this time was very much a tool of the oppressor. So the word race was never really used. The first documented usage was in 1570 in England. And while there were other words we used to describe people from different places, the idea that all people from one group have similar mental capacity or something of that nature, that was directly created over decades, hundreds of years of false pseudo-science with the purpose of making what we know as racism to justify empires. And while those empires might not exist anymore, race and racism continue to be highly significant in the 21st century. Next slide, please. If anyone's interested in further reading, another falsehood that I think American history teaches us is that this has always been a dominantly white country. As far back as the 1500s, all over the continent that we know as America today, there were people of many different races. I think there's a reason our high school K-12 textbooks tell us the story of the eastward expansion of what we call the United States government, because the racial makeup of the West Coast was a highly multicultural, diverse affair as far back as the 1550s. But our high school textbook purposefully leaves this out. And as a way to legitimize the idea that this is a white nation. Never was. Never has been. If people are curious about that, I can point you to some more resources after the talk. Next slide, please. So, anyone heard of the book 50 Shades of Grey? Well, we're not getting into detail. Shockingly, it used to be a saying before that book came out. So this is an old photo. These young ladies are adults now. The two children in that photo are twin sisters, born to those parents, same hospital room, same day. They discontinued the old school Adobe Acrobat, if anyone knows what I'm talking about. So that game that you have there with those 20 faces doesn't work anymore. But the highest I've ever seen a class get was 4 or 5 out of 20 in trying to guess the race and ethnicity of these individuals. Because race is only skin deep, and there's a lot of complications. Finally, I have this photo of these adorable little babies here, because race is not biological, it is social. And we use things like a person's speech, hair, dress, and other forms of cultural expression when we're implicitly trying to guess their race. Even if that's something that we might consider ourselves anti-racist people, but we are socialized to recognize this falsity called race. And without cues that are social in nature, such as your accent or what you're wearing, often we don't have enough information to make the assumptions that are ingrained in us about what race different people are. Next slide, please. So ultimately, all human beings carry the exact same genetic code. Do any of the other teachers here use Race, the Power of an Illusion, the documentary? Excellent, a couple of you. In that documentary, at one point, there's a multicultural group of American high school students, from people from all over the world. And they asked them, who do you think you're biologically more related to? Understandably, most of the kids of one racial group said I'd probably more in common with this other white person than with this Asian person. The actual genetic test they did showed that everyone was more or less equally similar. At this point in time, in the 21st century, physical natural scientists agree that there is no genetic trait or characteristic that all people of one race share that other people don't have. All human beings carry the exact same genetic code. The phenotypes we express are a product of our ancestors living in different parts of the world. But there is no biological distinction at all between anything we consider a racial category. It is all entirely sociological. And even if today, therefore, we understand that racism is wrong, we must continue to recognize the role that race plays, as is so central in this book, right? How am I doing on time? Right about there?
You're right about there.
Cool, that's it.
All right. So I am going to discuss basically three, sort of trying to tie these together, building on one another. And so I'm going to start with a discussion of whiteness and power, and then think a little bit about how whiteness and power plays out in imperialism, and particularly imperialism in the context of the British Empire and the rise of Zionism. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how Ta-Nehisi Coates learns, unlearns, and relearns his understanding of how power and race operate in the West Bank. So if we could switch, go to the next slide. I'm going to start with two other authors before we come to Coates. So the first of these that I'm going to use to help frame this discussion and sort of build on what Coates has to say, and really conveniently builds nicely on what Niraj said. I'm going to introduce first Layla Saad, who is a public advocate, an activist, and author. She self-identifies as an East African, Arab, British, Black, and Muslim woman. And in her acclaimed work, Me and White Supremacy, she succinctly states that white supremacy, white supremacy is an ideology, a paradigm, an institutional system, and a worldview that white people, by virtue of their white skin, are born into white supremacist values and expressions. But they're not the only people who operationalize it. She explicitly says that people of color can and do hold white privileges in some ways through colorism, white passing, proximity via class, and a variety of other experiences that are built into the social constructions that Niraj mentioned. So the second scholar that I wanted to talk about was Edward Said, who is a Palestinian scholar and activist whose work Orientalism, which was published in 1978, shaped scholarship of the Middle East, or the Southwest Asia and North Africa region, SWANA. And to borrow Niraj's Shrek reference, he pulled back layers of knowledge of Western scholars and constructions about the Orient. And when I talk about the Orient, I'm talking about the Middle East. So when I quote him, it's saying Orient, think Middle East. He said, the Orient is not an artifact of nature. The Orient is an idea that has a history and a tradition of thought, imagery, and vocabulary that have given it reality and presence in and for the West. And he says that Orientalism requires flexible positional superiority that manifests in the othering of peoples and cultures through claims of the mastery of knowledge aided by political and economic power. And if we understand this, then we can begin the process of unlearning the inherent diminutive mode of power as it operates from the West dominating the Middle East. So if we come to the next slide, then let's go to the next one. And the next one. All right. So Coates clearly describes racism and race as a species of power, very succinctly on page 125. He's in the Hebron out by himself, and he stopped and questioned about whether or not he was allowed to be there on the basis of his religion. And he says, if this had happened in America, I would have told you that the soldier who stopped me was black. And I guess he was here too. But in fact, there were black soldiers everywhere, lording their power over the Palestinians, many of whom in America have been seen as white. I was reminded of something I've long known, something I've written and spoken about, but was still stunned to see here in such stark detail, that race is a species of power and nothing else. And I knew here in this moment how I would have fallen in the hierarchy of power if I had told that black soldier that I was a Muslim. In the case of Palestine and Israel, Coates here has identified that 1, there is a system of white supremacy being enacted through and with a form of imperialism and colonialism. 2, that there is something familiar and unexpected in the way he saw race and power operationalized in the West Bank, a way in which the diminutive power flexed and shifted its shape and appearance, and that power dynamic is enmeshed with the experience of African Americans in the United States today and historically. When we think about whiteness, and I think we can advance the slide, thank you. When we think about whiteness and its connection to modern imperialism and Zionist settler colonialism, we can see just how unfixed, how permeable the boundaries of whiteness are, the ways in which Zionists sought to access power through the language of imperialism and white supremacy. Imperialism operates with a wide array of tools or repertoires of power. Economic, political, and military power are used to extend and justify influence and control over the territories and other people. Early modern and modern empires often justified their expansion through the civilizing mission, the idea that some people are backwards or savage or childlike or incompetent. And here we've got some illustrative examples of that in the next slide as well, in the case of the American Empire. We have examples here of how whiteness stands apart to save, guide, instruct those seen as not white. And the imagery stands in to depict what is whiteness and who does or does not fit that bill. And it does that regardless of their physical skin color. They are nevertheless coded in varying degrees of blackness, savageness, and uncivilized status. And if you go back to the previous slide really quickly, just pointing out here, you've got a very typically coded white features of the face on the British lion But the Irish person is depicted as a monkey and is depicted as black, and that's coded very specifically as black. Even though, skin color of the Irish, we would look at that and not normally code it that way. Nevertheless, for the purposes of social construction and identifiable symbolism, they were categorized in the same way in varying degrees of blackness. So if we skip ahead 2 slides, there we go. I'm going to talk a little bit very quickly about the shifting inclusion and exclusion of whiteness and its connection to power as noteworthy when we're thinking about the example of Britain and the debates over Zionism and the government support for a Jewish state in 1917. Herzl, who Coates talks about, wrote his book Der Judenstaat, and he formulated the idea of the creation of a Jewish nation state separate and distinct as a sovereign nation. This idea was then picked up and lobbied at the British government level by a man named Chaim Weizmann, who was an Eastern European Jew in England, lobbying the British for international recognition of support for a Jewish nation in Palestine. And then the third figure, the larger figure here, is Edward Montagu, a Jewish British cabinet member who was opposed to Zionism, preferring to live as a Jewish Briton, not as a British Jew, in his own words. Coates quotes numerous passages from Herzl's diary and book, as well as writings from Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who was also a migrant to Palestine in the Mandate and who founded one of the Jewish militias there. Both Jabotinsky and Herzl emphasized the goal of creating an outpost of civilization in Palestine and contrasted Jewish settlements with savages living in squalid villages in the language that they used. Montagu himself in 1917 described the danger of the creation of a Jewish state. He said it would be harmful to Jews because he believed that other European nations would then believe that Palestine is their national home, and every country would immediately desire to get rid of its Jewish citizens. And as victims of European anti-Semitism, also that Britain, in his words, our country, stands for principles, aims of civilization, which in no other country stands for in the same degree. He and others, he was saying, had endeavored to be a part of and worked and fought for the status of civilized citizenship in Britain, and he believed that the creation of a separate state would disrupt their access to that. So we can understand through these 3 folks that many Jews in Europe experienced life and anti-Semitism as oppressed peoples outside of whiteness. But they found access to power and influence through proximity to power and adherence to upholding white supremacist values and tools. And we also see through Edwin Montagu an ambiguous relationship with both being attached to whiteness and aware of the precarity of Jewish whiteness in his own concerns. So, how does this bring us back to Coates? He talks in this book about the way he learned, unlearned, and relearned his understanding of Palestine. In returning to the passage, the next slide, that I referenced earlier on, we can emphasize a different portion of what he said. In this chapter, he talks about how as a young man, he had a vague understanding of Israelis as whites and Palestinians as coded black, in the analogy to American racial hierarchy. But as he learned to write and took a job with The Atlantic and found himself acculturating in a predominantly white workplace, he found himself absorbing and expressing a different articulation and understanding of power. He passively accepted that Israel was a Jewish democracy and understood the conflict as complicated. Only when faced on the ground with the experiences of segregation in Palestine did he come to understand how clearly simple it was. And in that CBS morning interview that I mentioned earlier, he made it uncomplicated. It's really, really simple. Either what I saw is right or it's wrong. I am against a state that discriminates on the basis of ethnicity. I'm against that. And in a subsequent interview, he took up this understanding a step further to identify the dynamic that concerns him, that gives him fear to some extent. So I'll leave this quote from him to Stephen Colbert on The Late Show, when he said, "We would like to believe that when people do harmful and hurtful things, they are just mean people doing harmful and hurtful things. It's much more disturbing to orient yourself around the idea that victims are actually victimizing. So we'll leave that for thought and move on. Thank you.
I'm going to do the same thing and get up. Because I don't want to turn around and scrunch. And since I'm a spoiled child, I will adjust the situation to what I believe is most comfortable for me. So what is the message of the message? Let's read this. At dawn on Friday, the 9th of April, 1948, members of the Zionist paramilitary organizations, the Irgun and the Lehigh, invaded the sleeping village, moving from house to house, spraying machine gun fire, dropping grenades in through windows, and placing satchel charges of dynamite outside the home doors. They dynamited homes filled with people slaughtered, nursing infants and children in their mother's arms, and left others orphaned. This is a picture of some of the children that were killed during that slaughter. And this is written by someone named Dina El-Mouti in the Electronic Intifada in 2022, who is a direct descendant, and she is actually in the middle of that picture. The phrase "never again" has been uttered so many times in Yad Vashem, but its proximity to Deir Yashin makes a mockery of those words. I really would like to talk to you about hypocrisy and the fact that none is good, no, not one. Zionists strive to destroy testimonies, evidence, and truth, even to the point of literal muteness, as evidenced by children who stop speaking, sometimes for years, after exposure to catastrophic trauma. One of the things that I work on with Memorial Health and SIU School of Medicine are healing circles after the death of Ta-Nehisi. And we speak quite a bit about intergenerational trauma and the fact that what happens now to Ta-Nehisi, Sonia's mother, and to her entire family are not just about what happened to Sonia, but about the vicarious trauma that has occurred across the nation. Next slide, please. When we speak of conflict, intergenerational conflict, and intragenerational conflict, we are speaking of, as plenty of other people have said, power, but also of land and the justification that one group of people is not civilized enough, therefore not knowledgeable enough to manage a spot of land. Think Trail of Tears. Same justification. Think Aborigine in Australia. Think Congo. Think Brazil. Think Haiti. Okay, this is not new. Okay, and so the slide on the left, pretty much gives us a timeline of how Israel has taken over the land bit by bit. And inside the book, Ta-Nehisi Coates describes how from 1948 to 1950, 57, the Israelites or Israelis continue to just push into Palestinian territory, and he describes a type of incident or a type of methodology for doing so. He says that they quite often, and he's speaking to someone who is Palestinian while he is in Palestine, and he says quite often they don't go to the strong Palestinians. They don't go to the Palestinians who they know will fight back. They go to the good, nice, kind, right, placid Palestinians. And they go into their homes. They take the father or the leader of the household in handcuffs, bind him, and just stay there. They may not harm, quote unquote, harm the family, but they will occupy that home, and they will reign terror over that entire home. And the object is not to harm that family, but it is a psychological type of control and trauma. And so if you would imagine them going through, picking homes in several different villages and going through those homes and taking over, not the strong ones, but the weak ones. I don't know if you'd even want to call them weak. I think I should not call them weak. I would call them silent ones. And taking over. But it's not just that. It's not just the occupation. It is also the genocide. It is also the idea that every single time they do this, over years and years and years, there are thousands of people that are killed, disappeared. Okay? This is a genocide, all right? And it is a methodical, decades-long genocide that occurs with the approval of the United States, Europe, and other nations. Next slide, please. So then when we talk about genocide, we have to talk about what the stages are of genocide, right? I mean, it doesn't just come all of a sudden you're just killing everybody and then you know that there is a genocide. This genocide has been quite a few years in the making. It comes with what Niraj has already spoken of, the classification. You'd have to be able to classify who is civilized and who is not civilized, who is an animal, who is, right? Because this goes along with the justification for taking over the land. Then you'd have to erect some type of symbolism that makes everybody know that your tribe, your clan is the best clan. So you have your flag, and you have your song, and you have your pledge, my country 'tis of thee, and you put your hand over, right, your heart, and right, so because at that point you are socializing all of the citizens of that group that they need to be patriotic and loyal. Has anybody heard the term loyalty lately in the news? So you need to be able to really solidify this type of symbolism as an act of cultural conquest, all right? Then at that point, and I will say this, it doesn't have to go necessarily in this order, but these are some of the aspects. Once you have this idea, this classification, you can begin to discriminate because now you've already told everybody, this is our culture, this is the number one culture in this land. Anyone who does not follow this culture because of their ancestry, because of their religion, because of whatever, is a bad person, and we're all good people. So then we are justified in continuing to discriminate against them. It's not just about taking their land. Now it's about the power that has already been mentioned. So your laws, your regulations, all of that comes into play, right? Into what is called the organization, all right? They're planned, okay? The language takes hold where everybody can understand that a certain type of people, a certain type of children are good for nothing and therefore not worthy of access to resources that the good people have, all right? And then there's the polarization. Shift them off. They're not working. We don't like them. They're not like us, right? What? Remember Super Bowl? They're not like us. And we need to get rid of them. Remember that in Hitler's era, there was the ghettoization first, right? Okay, and he got that from the United States, right? Okay, so then you're preparing for something larger, right? You have to actually prepare, okay? And so leaders will instill in all of the cultural practices in the institutions. We talk about 5 major social institutions: the family, the religious system, not one religion, the religious system of all religions, right? The government, the economy, and the education system. 5 basic social institutions. Preparation becomes an act of instilling this goodness versus badness, this civilized versus uncivilized, this, right, all of these dichotomies into every single institution so everybody knows where they are. And what that does is it shames the minoritized group into knowing that they are minoritized, into understanding that there is no use in fighting because they are simply not enough, all right? So then you come with the persecution and the extermination, and then after that, you just deny everything, deny, deny, deny. We didn't do that. Or how do you deny? You deny it by saying it was their own fault. They did it. They did it to themselves. Check your FBI records right now and look and see which groups have the most violence, right? And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because you have created a circumstance whereby those people are living a certain way. And then once you have everything set, you have everything prepared, they're living this way, you can document the way that they're living and you can say, see, I told you that they were inferior. When the inferiority was a part of the plan in the first place, which is why we no longer call people minority. We call them minoritized. Does that make sense? Because it has been a plan all along. Next slide, please. So then, in the book, Ta-Nehisi quotes someone and says that Israel is an apartheid state. All right, now hit that space bar. Well, when we think about apartheid, what do you think about? Think about South Africa, right? Okay, that's the largest one, okay? And what happened in South African apartheid was that you had children, you had generations of children who were educated in segregated, right, school systems, okay? And school systems whereby they did not have the same access to resources as de Klerk's people, okay, the Afrikaners, okay? And so then that self-fulfilling prophecy flows on through, because if you're not educating the minoritized group, then later on you can say, well, see, I told you, they're just not smart, okay? Now, on the other side is Palestinian groups and their children. Another thing that we also understand about trauma is that if children are attempting to learn in dire circumstances, then they cannot retain very well. So when I tell you that genocide and colonialism and imperialism are psychological and sociological, I really mean it. You get to the people's hearts and to their heads, and then you can control their behaviors. In social psychology of social inequality, we talk about the ABCs of any type of action, right? Your affect, which is your feelings, your behaviors, which are governed by also your cognitions, which are your thoughts. Plenty of people, even and Niraj and I often talk about this, in our rush to be such intellectual magnets, we always talk about reason and logic as if a subjective something or the ways that people feel have nothing to do with what they're studying or what their results are. And in sociology, we are very, very aware that there is no such thing as absolute reason or absolute logic. Your feelings are a part of everything that you do, even down to the research question that you ask. And that research question that you ask may be a factor of what group that you are in society at the time. Hence, all of the DSMs that said that drapetomania was a viable disease. Do you know what drapetomania is? It is the escape of an enslaved person from their master. The idea was that these enslaved people must be insane if they would like to escape from the arms of their loving master. That's in the DSM. Okay? So when we talk about the history of the United States, and Niraj already pointed to the ideas that so many of our intellects were racist. Survival of the fittest, Herbert Spencer, right, who was living during imperial times and was a part of the justification, right? I know you don't want me to talk to you about Thomas Jefferson, right? Who also set into motion scientific racism with his suspicion, right, that the Africans and the indigenous were not of the same sound mind, body, and soul as the Europeans. Oh, the indigenous might be able to be reformed, but the Africans absolutely not. Okay? And so this is a history that is born into the very conception of the United States. And with the United States power, we're able to take this beautiful racism global. And so another thing that people don't learn is that Hitler got his ideas from the United States, is that Santo Domingo got their ideas from the United States, and that Israel got their ideas from the United States. And in the book, Ta-Nehisi Coates is very particular about quoting the current Prime Minister, Netanyahu, who talks about Palestinians as animals, as not human. Do you remember 3/5 of a human in the United States? When you have power, you also have the power to socialize others because of the prestige and the property that you already have. So one of the things that we talk about with ultra-capitalism is that it is a heady type of brainwashing scheme, because what you're doing is dangling carrots in front of other people and saying, see, Don't you want what I have? Don't you want what I have? Oh yes, sometimes I want what you got. I want what you got. I want what you got. What do I have to do to get what you got? Well, I'm going to write a formula for you. You have to divulge yourself of your own culture. You have to give up any ties to your homeland. You have to turn on your own people for my power, the growth of my own power, and you have to sell your very soul. This is what white supremacy really is all about. It is about absolute conquer. It is about leaving people without any identity of their own history or of their own pride in themselves and in their people, and then refusing to teach it to them. Carter G. Woodson had a quote. He says, "Those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biography and history." What's going on in the United States right now? Because Ruby Bridges is not critical race theory. And so what we understand is this race for power makes none of us good. And yet when you call someone racist, the first thing they'll say is, "Oh, I'm a good person." No, baby. There is no one who is good. And the idea that Ta-Nehisi Codes ends with is a fear that if Black people actually got that much power, what would we do with it? The Black Liberation Movement was split on Palestine. You had some people who wanted to work with Israel, like our past Vice President. You had some people who wanted to take over, like Malcolm X. Right? Neither of them would have come up with a solution that would have worked for all of us. And his greatest fear is that there may be no real solution. Thank you.
All right.
Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, I was gonna say something real bad.
You got more, Lisa?
Yeah, I guess I'll go and say this. Right quick. Black people were talking about genocide and actually appealed to the United Nations in 1951. Okay, in 1951, the United States understood, got it? Okay, the United States understood that, and this was Paul Robeson, W.B. Du Bois, all of these people. W.B. Du Bois actually was not able to go because he was still being sort of quarantined by McCarthy trials. And so they went to United Nations and they appealed to them to tell them that the United States was committing genocide on African Americans here, on Black people here. The United States, in a little tricky dick type of move, went to the United Nations and diverted their attention to other things so that the agenda went past and the African American plea for help in genocide never was addressed in the meeting that people were supposed to talk about it. And I'd like for us to understand all the behind the scenes stuff that we don't see when we are trying to talk about how good we are or how good our nation is. Our nation is just a nation full of powerful people who are colonizers and imperialists and uber capitalists, just like anyone else, okay? And so, yeah, is that a Hitler salute?
Yes.
Well, I mean, you could put all of the things around it and say that it is. All right? It's coming from South Africa. right, of the de Klerk era, right, you could say all kinds of things. But when people who are already minoritized look at that, it's a quick yes. Because we are still all dealing with our own vicarious and intergenerational trauma from living in these United States. Even those of us who would call ourselves successful are still traumatized. Still can't trust y'all. Not a one. Muhammad Ali said if there was 10,000 snakes coming at him, right? And one of them said, oh, you can trust me? Is he supposed to leave the door open to let the one snake come in that says that you can trust him and then actually trust that one snake? This is the problem. So then you have South Carolina that still flies that rebel flag. Trauma, right? And so now you have parents who still have to talk to their children in a different way about police engagement because of years and years of trauma and years of evidence that this is still a very racist nation that wants to recreate racism all around the world. Now I'm done.
All right, can y'all hear me all right? All right, so I'm going to start by thanking Christy for kind of doing a lot of the behind-the-scenes facilitation work for this panel. I really appreciate you. And all the panelists as well for kind of giving us these kind of global contexts, bigger discourses, right? Larger histories around what we're reading with the message. So what I think my goal here as the literary professor is going to be hone in on the text, come back to the book. I'm going to give y'all a bunch of different quotes to look at, and my hope is that we're not going to be able to unpack all of them, but you might see something that you want to touch on in the Q&A, which I'm told is supposed to be more of an interactive discussion than a Q&A. So if you have something like that, a place you want to latch onto, kind of find that moment and use this as that opportunity. In terms of the slides, yeah, you can just keep it up and I'll tell you just when to move to the next one, and you can just put the whole thing up, the whole slide up. Okay, so as a professor of English, I'm always interested in the role of the writer and the shape of the writing itself. In reading the message, I noticed that Coates is also particularly invested in making his position as the author clear to the reader, and that the book's structure reveals much about what Coates is ultimately trying to accomplish. This semester, I'm teaching a course focused on memoir as a literary genre. My students, one of which is definitely here today, have learned that memoir balances this kind of utilitarian reporting of information associated with nonfiction usually, right? It balances that alongside the aesthetic and the artistic qualities usually linked to fictional writing. So memoirs combine personal experience and memory with collective history and public records, right? So coming back to Coates, having published The Beautiful Struggle in 2008 and then the National Book Award winner Between the World and Me in 2015, Coates is already an experienced memoirist. And as he notes in the introduction of this book, which is directed to his students at Howard University, Coates sees his writing as part of a larger emancipatory mandate that extends through a robust Black literary tradition. And this helps to explain why his most recognized book, Between the World and Me, takes inspiration from James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, which was published much earlier in 1963. And while Coates is known as a journalist, he also writes fiction, right? His debut novel, The Water Dancer, and his run of Black Panther comics from 2016 to 2021 reveal Coates' attentiveness to place and the stories that come out of places, and even fictional places like Wakanda. So the message I'm going to suggest today brings each of these concerns regarding memoir, place, and literary tradition together. And to do so, Coates must first contend with the colonial roots of travel memoirs, of travel writing. So I've got this slide up for y'all to take a look at. I'm not going to read these quotes out loud to you, but you can take a look at that, and it kind of aligns with a lot of what has already been said here today, right? So as historian Jennifer Morgan argues, travel writing was used to solidify a, quote, rubric of monstrously raced Amerindian and African women, which allowed Europeans to articulate shifting perceptions of themselves as religiously, culturally, and phenotypically superior to those black or brown persons that they sought to define. Nash also clarifies that travel writing was used by abolitionists and anti-abolitionists alike to reinforce, quote, connections between race, animality, the legitimacy of slavery, and black women's monstrous and fecund bodies, end quote. So it's important to note that it's not like abolitionists thought about this differently. This is baked into the way of thinking, right? So I projected just a couple of excerpts here from 16th and 17th century travel narratives to help illustrate that this kind of writing is known to exoticize and marginalize others by casting cultural judgments, right? And obviously, Coates isn't a colonial era traveler documenting his voyages to Africa and the New World, so you might be wondering, how is this history relevant to this work that we're reading today? Right? You can move on, next slide. So when Coates himself tells us on page 73 that the medium is the message, he's telling us that he's wary of this kind of travel narrative. He already knows this history. He's telling us that he understands that the way information is communicated in travel writing automatically positions the writer as an authority figure over the places and the people that are being written about. So if Coates is going to continue to imagine the oppressed as human beings, as he says here, then he must be wary about not just what he is going to write. So he's not just wary about his content, he's also thinking about how he's going to write it, which is his medium, right? So I'm interested in thinking about the shape of this book and what Coates sees his voice accomplishing within its form and structure. Coates' perspective is unlike those colonial examples that I showed you earlier, because his point of view works always at two levels at once, right? And so I've put some of those levels up, at the personal level, at the political level, internal, external, subjective, objective. He humanizes as well as reports, right? He's reflective, thinking internally, as well as he's curious, looking externally. And that idea of curiosity, I think, I think it's only that if we grasp the duality of Coates' writing that we can fully appreciate how each chapter of the book is contributing to a larger decolonial project. So moving forward, I'm going to briefly address each of the sections that we have and discuss the relationship between Coates and place. You can move to the next slide. So the first place that we arrive at with Coates is Senegal, right? This section begins with a poem by Sonia Sanchez titled Rebirth. The question of rebirth is clearly central to this section, but we might ask who or what exactly is being reborn. Rebirth is most obviously connected to the island of Gorée, upon which Elmina Castle sits, the first European slave trading post in sub-Saharan Africa, and the last point in West Africa that enslaved black people walked through before entering the Middle Passage. And it's known as the Door of No Return. For Coates and many in the African diaspora, this place constitutes a rebirth of ancestry, of home, and belonging snatched away. But I think there is another more impactful rebirth for Coates in this chapter, which is a rebirth of curiosity. Coates is critical of himself for getting caught up in a mythic, albeit potentially empowering, African past at the expense of the Senegalese people all around him. The limits of this approach, Coates realizes, is the trap of travel writing, which allows a writer to experience and represent a living place as though it belongs to them, as though it exists for them. Next slide. If Senegal highlights rebirth, then South Carolina deals with the dangers of redemption. In this chapter, Coates recalls the history of political violence against black people during the post-bellum Reconstruction period, and he critiques the Southern Democratic Party of the time that referred to itself as the Redeemers. This white supremacist group engaged in a revisionist history and sought to redeem symbols of terrorism. He argues that theirs was, and continues to be, because there are redeemers that exist today, it's not gone away, a distorted redemption that isn't about saving a historical narrative at all. It's not about saving a legacy at all, but it's about killing a future. So these quotes indicate that there's another redemption worth pursuing in this chapter, though. And that is the redemption of the imagination that comes out of curiosity. Writers and educators, I think this is what Coates is saying, have a responsibility to put forward, quote, new language and stories that allow people to imagine that new policies are possible, end quote. And we can all play a part in this role, I think. And this is what makes ideas like diversity, equity, and inclusion dangerous. The fear is not, as Coates says, that we will convince their children of a different dogma, but that we will convince them that they have the power to form their own. Next slide. The book ends with Coates' time in Palestine, and this section is about reparation. Reparation for displaced, dispossessed, and decimated Palestinians in the Nakba. But it's also Coates himself who wants to make amends for an argument in one of his most popular writings, The Case for Reparations, right? I don't know how many of y'all have read that piece as well. In that piece, he suggests that Germany's payments to Israel might serve as a model for the U.S. to follow when repaying debt owed to Black Americans who have faced enslavement, segregation, and discrimination in the U.S. Given the book's ending, I'm not sure that Coates feels that he's actually successful in making these amends or successful in this regard. The deceit that he speaks of is one that he allowed by being incurious and by neglecting to expand the boundaries of imagination beyond himself. That's kind of what he's speaking about whenever he talks about his sense of kind of regret here. Ultimately, I think Coates' voice opens a wound of absence. He writes not as an expert, but as a reminder of the voices that are silenced when we don't ask, when he says earlier, ask the wrong questions. It's not about finding the right answers, it's about asking the wrong questions. So I'll just end with this. The message doesn't give us the answer, but it does give us the medium. Be curious, help others to imagine otherwise, question yourself.
We can open this to questions if you all wanted to start with your own questions, comments, or thoughts. And we've got one, and then as hopefully this will just sort of unfold naturally, but if not, we can pick up, and we're good at filling in gaps.
I do have a question about the 10 steps of genocide, which is pretty interesting. You had mentioned that there is a form of acquiescence with regards to the Europeans approving what is going on in Palestine right now. Can you tell me what stage do you think it is right now with what's happening? Because just briefly, when we look at the history, Israel has never responded so pronouncedly. It is pronounced. With me being a Cold War veteran, the carpet bombing is, so when you hear the term carpet bombing in relation to strategic bombing, it looks like genocide. So just through your estimation, where do you think the stage is right now? And talk about the acquiescence. We have, as a country, but you did say that you feel so there's a level of acquiescence that the Europeans are demonstrating right now. And tell me, what stage do you think it is right now in that 10-step stage?
It looks like extermination to me. It looks like extermination to me. Everything else has already pretty much been covered. And the death that we see constantly over the news, and even understanding that we're not seeing all of it, because still our news mediums are governed by powerful people who will only give us, snippets of what they think can help to control us. And I think that that plays into the second part of your question, is why we seem to be acquiescent. First, because we don't have all of the information. Second, because we've been socialized to trust the leaders. Third, because if we said something, 3 fingers pointing back. 3 fingers pointing back. The idea that we would point our fingers at somebody, and this has happened in the United States quite often, when we talk about the indigenous schools, the residential schools of the indigenous, Canada, China, they're always ready to say, United States, y'all need to shut up because we know what you did last summer, right? And so there's this issue of not being able to really say much, in addition to the fact that, yeah, we're pretty badass over here. We have amassed a lot of power. Still we're a superpower. If you think about Macron and Germany and everybody else was laughing at Trump. We would see, right, little snippets on the news of all of them gathering around at a state dinner or something, and they're making fun of Trump. And now we see Macron, right? Macron is in the White House? What? Right? This is not anything that would have ever happened. Mexico is acquiescing. Canada is acquiescing. Everybody's afraid of the 25% tariff. And if you make him mad, that's what's going to happen. So the acquiescence is at one point forced, and then at another point guided.
And one last question, just
Yes.
to be brief. I was curious because why do you think that? One last question. This means a lot to me because I'm really familiar with what's happened. So when we think about the rock-throwing Palestinians of the Gaza Strip, that's an old school scene. But why do you think that it's not in stage 10 in denial right now? You had mentioned stage 9, which is
They
the
go together,
extermination.
though.
Oh, so you're saying
Yeah, it's
that?
not a linear thing.
Okay. Okay. So
They go
you're-
together.
so-
People use the microphone because we can't hear back here at all.
Oh, me, you're
We
talking
have
to me.
no idea what's
Oh.
going on.
Sorry,
Me or them?
me.
Okay, gotcha.
Both
Yeah.
of you.
Okay, sorry, I apologize. Yeah, the stages of genocide don't have to occur in a linear fashion. And no stage has to happen one at a time.
I would say, just to add, they've been going on. The only one that I was looking at, and I can't immediately say is not happening ongoing continuously, is the symbolization kind of one. They don't have the control. Israel doesn't have the control to force Palestinians to wear one thing or other. It's not happening in the same quite clear way. The denial is happening. The way in which the United States has said over and over again, well, we're waiting to see, they're going to get back to us. They're going to report back to us, right? That's been constant for 15, 16 months. The extermination is going on in Gaza. It's kind of relatively paused in Gaza right now because they're really busy exterminating the West Bank and displacing more than 40,000, 60,000 people in the last couple of weeks. With complete and total annihilation of infrastructure. All of these pieces are going on at the same time with varying levels of intensity for the last 76 years. They've all been happening. And sometimes they pop up on our radar and sometimes they don't, for the same reasons that Lisa just mentioned, that we're not getting it in our news feeds, or we're too consumed with other things that are popping up in our lives.
And I just wanted to. So speaking about the 10 stages of genocide, and I haven't done the research that you have, Lisa, so you can kind of guide me on this a little bit, is it doesn't seem like after stage 10 it's over.
No,
Oh,
absolutely.
Right? It seems like it's ongoing, and there are The idea that after extermination and denial, you continue to build origin stories, right? And it's the origin story that sticks.
Yes.
And it's the origin story that continues to erase
Yes.
what actually existed beforehand.
And that was what the Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois was saying in 1951.
Yeah.
We are still in the middle of a genocide in the United States. And Ta-Nehisi Coates even talks about the immigration policies and whom we will take in as refugees and whom we won't. And Israel has taken in refugees from South Sudan and Eritrea and then sent them back. And we never really knew about that. That wasn't in our news feeds. But the idea, once again, that old trope that Africans are, animals or whatever. Yeah, it's a continuous phase.
What happens when genocide becomes like a global issue, right? Like, because we're making these connections and we're saying that there's genocide happening here, but it's not just happening there, it's happening
No,
in these
it's
other
all
places,
over.
being allowed by other places too. So like,
Yes.
taking this like framework of genocide that we've learned and kind of expanding it seems really integral to what kind of your research is talking about.
Yes, Algeria, all over the place. And what happens is you get into, and this is why capitalism is so important as well, because the idea of conquering and having this imperialist type of idea, I want to go discover new lands or whatever, it's a constant thing. People, like little kids, I'm bored. I want to go, I want to go, you have that, I want that, right? It's an idea, it's never over because we are never satisfied.
To kind of lead in with that, so Israel, going back to World War II, the majority of the people who have settled in Israel, or ancestors settled in Israel, kind of came from fleeing from what happened in the Holocaust. So they were very much persecuted, and so how do they go from being persecuted and seeing this genocide in such a massive and horrifying way that truly touched the world and made us see a part of ourselves that we didn't want to see, now become the aggressors? And is there a lesson to be told to that, to all marginalized people, be it your gender, be it your sexual orientation, be it the race, in quotations, of whatever, so you don't fall into that same trap? Is there a lesson we can learn from that?
That's the problem. We can't figure out the lesson. Look, I was at, Phoenix Center, queer folks, right? And they have the same issue with queer folks, minoritizing and, not really taking care of POC queer people who are people of color. Inside every single ethnic or racial group, there is a stratification, right? Marginalization type of thing, which is why somebody mentioned colorism. Somebody has to be better than the other. Somebody has to get, we used to have the paper bag test, the brown paper bag test, even to get into HBCUs, okay? So the point is, we can't find the answer yet, and therefore, even if the marginalized, this country was started off with people who were traumatized in other areas. So all they did was brought that trauma over here and try to figure out how they could, traumatize somebody else like they had been traumatized. And so we haven't figured it out yet.
I don't really have a question. I wish I brought my copy of the book. I'm silly and I didn't. But I know I was writing about, it's okay. I think it's repeated though by Coates, like reparations versus, I can't remember the other R word, but there's like two words that he, like,
Redemption.
Redemption, yes. Like, that's an idea of the struggle, I think, like just that, like, how do you find that balance? And I don't know if there is an answer. And I think, like what the quotes that you put up from the like South Carolina section of the book about when you have power, that you don't have to be curious about people who don't, and you stop thinking about that. I think that's one of those things. It's just, regardless of who has the power, it is kind of transformative sometimes, to some degree, in a negative way.
So I can, I guess the historian in me wants to give like a very concrete and specific kind of like example from the past. Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who formed one of the militias that was responsible in the Palestinian Mandate period. I mean, he didn't come as part of the Holocaust. He came out of the Pale because of the pogroms that were taking place in Russia and Eastern Europe. And very much his sort of ideology was that he wanted to create a militant response so that it would never happen to him again. Is like he felt like part of what he needed to do to protect his people and his community was to establish a martial, trained kind of group of people who would have guns and who would protect themselves in ways that they didn't when they were forced to leave Europe. So that trauma from his experiences in Eastern Europe were what drove him to take up arms to protect himself and what he imagined as his community and became his community. But then it didn't stop, right? It continued because of that trauma response. Gabor Mate and a number of people are talking about like how do you heal like social, like large scale trauma from this in order for people to start seeing the world in an without that lens of trauma distorting what they're seeing. They at this stage, I would say like Israeli Jews still are living, have never grappled with the trauma of what they experienced and are not grappling with the trauma that they are inflicting. And so they continue to do it from a place of like defensiveness that is dangerous, is self-centered and dangerous. That inward turns outward as part of that. So it is very much like a cycle.
Time for a couple more questions, probably.
It's not a question, it's a comment. It seems to me Nelson Mandela is one of the few people or examples of the attempt to reconciliation. It was the term of people needing to express the wrongs, people who created the wrongs needing to acknowledge that they did this, and somehow getting past it. But that's one of the only examples I can think of that kind of massive trauma for a long period of time in apartheid in South Africa, where there was an attempt to do it differently so that it didn't just continue.
And it didn't work.
And I understand. I mean, how do you teach compassion?
One more question or so before we wrap up.
I have one. Oh, thank you. I'd like to hear from everyone on the panel about this terminology that we seem to be, if we're not struggling with it, I hope we will begin and continue to struggle with it. Minoritized and minority. And how each one of you understand that in the context of this discussion. I struggle with it. I struggle with minority. I don't use that term.
And I agree with why that's an important question.
I'm struggling with it.
Well, in sociology, the textbook that I use in my intro class makes the case that minority and majority, when we're using them in these questions of race and inequality, is not about numerical representation. It's about power. Right. Because apartheid South Africa was 90+% black. And I think here in the United States we've become so used to thinking about minority, majority as a numerical quality. But even if non-white people become 51% of the population in a few years, We have seen the backlash and reaction that this has sparked in the American right wing and how it has aligned itself with reclaiming America as a white national state. And so I think that's a good question. I think those terms should be used for power and distribution of resources and cultural and material inequalities. Minority groups are those that have a minority of these things, regardless of our actual composition in the population.
I use it a different way. I say minoritized. For me, it is embedded in the policies and the procedures of the United States. The policies that say how many refugees we can take from countries of color, how many voluntary immigrants that we can take from countries of color, and how much the I-9 will actually cost, how much the lawyer fees will cost. It's about the policies that are set around the globe on the equivalency of intellect and education. An 8th grade education in South Sudan equals a 12th grade education, or vice versa, I'm sorry. A 12th grade, equals 8th grade. So if you come here as a refugee from South Sudan, you're basically only coming with what the United States considers an 8th grade education, which then affects your income, right? So it's something that is written in the policies of the powerful to make sure that those groups, whatever their numerical representation is, that their access to resources is still minoritized.
I think I have switched primarily to using the idea of marginalized because, that idea of minoritized in the way that it's being used in these contexts, as Niraj has already pointed out, has nothing to do with the number of people involved. It's the people who are shoved aside, pushed to the margins of power, who have the ability to cross over those margins briefly and move out. If we think about it in the sort of the global context in the way that Saeed talked about it, it's that idea of positional diminutive power. So that anyone can be marginalized almost anyone, but certainly can be marginalized depending on how that power structure is operating in a moment. And I think allows for a greater understanding of how that flexes and changes depending on the position. So that's kind of where I think I've been leaning away from minoritized and more towards marginalized is the better descriptor.
Mostly everything's been covered. I'll just say that the IZED, right, that's the part we're kind of focusing on versus it has to do with placing emphasis on kind of social action rather than going back to Niraj's points in the beginning on the biological or empirical realities, whatever those may be, of the situation. And we can think about that with other terms too, orientalized, exoticized, right? When I'm in my classes, do we say slave or do we say enslaved person, right? There's the action is what is important in that situation. The slave is not a biological reality. Enslaved persons, right? Enslavers. So those are like just tweaking the way that we think through the language, I think is most important.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks to all of our panelists, to Center for Lincoln Studies for getting us a copy of the book, all of my colleagues for passing out copies of the book, and I am planning to send out a feedback form to help inform future events like this to everyone who registered, who did not register, and you'd like to get that, be sure to sign up over there. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight. This is good.
The dates from Jericho and some spinach pies that our friend Amina brought, so thank you so much. So make sure, or she'll be forced to take them home. Oh, darn.
Thank you all.
So we getting good over it.
Yes, as long as you